The wind howled across the desolate Montana plains as Samuel Whitmore counted his last 3 silver dollars. What he did next would either save his failing ranch or unleash something that had been waiting in the shadows for over a century. By morning, the cry of a newborn would awaken spirits that the living world had long forgotten. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Samuel Whitmore had always been a man of few words, but the silence that now surrounded his ranch felt different, heavier, more oppressive. The autumn of 1887 had brought with it a drought that seemed to mock his every attempt at survival. His cattle lay scattered across the parched earth like broken promises, their bones bleaching under the relentless sun that refused to yield even a drop of mercy. The Whitmore Ranch had once been the pride of Eagle Creek Valley, stretching across 2,000 acres of what his grandfather had called God's own country. 3 generations of Whitmore men had worked this land, each adding their own chapter to a story that now seemed destined to end with Samuel. At 34, he had the weathered hands of a man twice his age and the hollow eyes of someone who had watched his dreams turn to dust. The drought had started in June, just as the spring calves were finding their legs. What began as a few cloudless weeks had stretched into months of biblical proportions. The creek that had given the valley. Its name had dried to a trickle, then to cracked mud, then to nothing at all. Samuel had watched his neighbors pack their belongings and head east, their wagons heavy with defeat and empty of hope. But Samuel stayed. Not out of stubbornness, though his late father had always said the Whitmore men were too proud for their own good. He stayed because this land was all he had left of his family, all he had left of the woman who had promised to be his wife before consumption took her the previous winter. Margaret's grave sat on the hill overlooking the ranch house, marked by a simple wooden cross that Samuel had carved with his own hands. Leaving would mean abandoning her, and that was something he simply could not do. The bank notices had been coming for weeks, each one more urgent than the last. Ezra Hawthorne, the banker in town, had been patient at first, speaking in soft tones about temporary difficulties and seasonal adjustments. But patience, like water, had run dry. The final notice, delivered by a nervous clerk who wouldn't meet Samuel's eyes, gave him 30 days to settle his debts or face foreclosure. Samuel had spent those 30 days trying everything he could think of. He'd sold his father's pocket watch, his mother's wedding ring, even the rifle that had belonged to his grandfather. The money barely covered a week's interest on what he owed. He'd written letters to distant relatives, swallowing his pride with each carefully crafted plea for help. The responses, when they came at all, were filled with their own tales of hardship and regret. It was on the 29th day, with foreclosure looming like a storm cloud on the horizon, that Samuel made his way to Millbrook's trading post. The establishment sat at the crossroads where the main trail split toward the territorial capital and the Indian reservation, a ramshackle building that served as everything from general store to unofficial courthouse to the valley's primary source of gossip. Jeremiah Millbrook had run the trading post for as long as anyone could remember. A compact man with silver hair and sharp blue eyes, he had the reputation of being able to find anything for the right price. Some said he'd been a buffalo hunter in his younger days. Others claimed he'd been a cavalry scout. Millbrook himself never spoke of his past, but the scars on his hands and the careful way he watched every door told their own story. The trading post was busier than usual when Samuel arrived. A group of cowhands from the Double Bar Ranch were loading supplies while their foreman argued with Millbrook about credit terms. Near the back of the store, 2 prospectors examined pickaxes and pans with the desperate intensity of men who believed their next swing might strike gold. The air was thick with the smell of leather, tobacco, and something else, something that made Samuel's skin crawl with unease. Millbrook caught Samuel's eye and nodded toward a corner table where they could speak privately. Samuel had known the trader for years, had bought supplies from him during better times. But something in the older man's expression made him hesitate. There was a calculating look there, the expression of someone who had already figured out what Samuel needed before he'd even spoken. "Samuel," Millbrook said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I heard about your troubles. Bank's been asking questions about your land." Samuel nodded, not trusting his voice. The shame of his situation felt heavier in this public place, surrounded by men who were making their own way in the world while he was drowning in debt. "I might have something that could help," Millbrook continued, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "But it's not the kind of help most Christian men would consider." Before Samuel could ask what he meant, Millbrook stood and walked to the back of the store. He returned carrying a small wooden box, the kind that might hold jewelry or important documents. The wood was darker than anything Samuel had seen, almost black, and carved with symbols that seemed to shift and move in the lamplight. "A trader came through here last week," Millbrook said, setting the box on the table. "Unusual. Fellow claimed to be from the territories up north. Had this with him, along with some other items I'm not sure I should have bought." Samuel stared at the box, feeling an odd reluctance to touch it. The symbols carved into its surface seemed familiar somehow, as if he'd seen them in dreams he couldn't quite remember. "What's in it?" Instead of answering, Millbrook opened the box. Inside, nestled in faded red velvet, was a single silver dollar. But this wasn't like any coin Samuel had ever seen. The silver seemed to move with a life of its own, swirling patterns that caught the light and held it. Where the eagle should have been, there was instead the image of a woman's face, her eyes closed as if in sleep or death. "The trader said it was made by the Lakota," Millbrook whispered. "Part of some ceremony that went wrong." He wouldn't say much more, just that it was meant to settle a debt that couldn't be paid with ordinary money. Samuel reached for the coin, then stopped. Something about it made his chest tighten with fear. "What kind of debt?" "The kind that involves the spirits of the dead," Millbrook replied. "The trader said it could buy something that money alone couldn't purchase. Something that would change a man's fate, but at a cost that might be more than he could bear." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside. Through the window, Samuel could see a small group approaching the trading post. At the front walked a man in a worn cavalry uniform, his brass buttons tarnished and his hat pulled low over his eyes. Behind him came two others, their faces hidden beneath broad-brimmed hats. And between them walked a woman. She was clearly Lakota. Her long black hair braided with beads and feathers, her buckskin dress decorated with intricate quillwork. But it was her condition that made Samuel's breath catch in his throat. She was heavily pregnant, her belly swollen with life, and there was something in her dark eyes that spoke of depths of sorrow Samuel had never imagined. "That's Captain Morrison," Millbrook said, his voice tight with distaste. "Used to be stationed at Fort Belknap before the Army discharged him for reasons they won't discuss. Now he makes his living in ways that decent folk don't talk about." The group entered the trading post, and Morrison's eyes immediately found Millbrook. "I've got something you might be interested in," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "This here's White Dawn, a Lakota woman from the northern reservation. She's with child, due any day now, and she needs a place to stay." Samuel found himself staring at the woman, who stood with quiet dignity despite her obvious distress. Her eyes met his for just a moment, and in that instant, he saw something that made his heart race. Not attractive, though she was beautiful in a way that seemed to transcend earthly concerns. It was recognition, as if he'd been waiting his entire life to meet this stranger. "I'm not running a charity," Millbrook replied, but his eyes were on the silver coin still sitting in its box. "And I don't traffic in human beings." Morrison laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Nobody's trafficking anybody. The woman needs help, and I'm willing to make it worth your while. $1, and she's your responsibility." Samuel felt the words leave his mouth before he could stop them. "I'll pay it." Every eye in the trading post turned toward him. The cowhands stopped their conversation. The prospectors looked up from their equipment, and even the woman called White Dawn seemed surprised by his declaration. "You don't know what you're saying," Millbrook warned, but his hand moved toward the silver coin. "I know exactly what I'm saying," Samuel replied, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. Something was driving him forward, some force that felt larger than his own will. "I'll pay the $1. Morrison's smile was cold as winter. "Well then, looks like we have a deal." Without thinking, Samuel reached for the silver coin. The moment his fingers touched its surface, the world seemed to shift around him. The sounds of the trading post faded, replaced by something that might have been singing or might have been screaming. The walls appeared to breathe, and the shadows in the corners took on shapes that shouldn't have been possible. But most disturbing of all was the change in White Dawn's expression. Her eyes widened with what looked like recognition, and she spoke a single word in Lakota that Samuel somehow understood despite never having heard the language before. "Wakantanka." The Great Spirit. Samuel pressed the coin into Morrison's palm, feeling as if he were sealing a pact with forces beyond his understanding. The moment the transaction was complete, the former captain tipped his hat and walked out of the trading post, leaving Samuel alone with a pregnant Lakota woman and the growing certainty that he had just changed the course of his life in ways he couldn't begin to imagine. White Dawn stepped forward, her movements graceful despite her condition. When she spoke, her English was perfect, tinged with an accent that made every word sound like music. "You do not know what you have done, Samuel Whitmore." The fact that she knew his name when he hadn't given it should have shocked him, but somehow it didn't. Nothing about this situation followed normal rules, and Samuel was beginning to understand that normal rules might not apply to what was coming. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I know I've given you a place to stay," he said, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. "And I know you're going to have a baby soon." White Dawn's laugh was like wind through autumn leaves. "The baby is not just any child, Samuel. This child carries the blood of warriors who died defending our people, the spirits of those who were promised justice that never came. When this child cries for the first time, it will be heard by more than just the living." Millbrook had been listening to their conversation with a growing alarm. "Samuel, you need to think about what you're doing. There are things in this world that don't follow the laws of God or man, and you're walking into something that could destroy you." But Samuel was already moving toward the door, White Dawn beside him. The weight of the silver coin transaction seemed to be settling into his bones, and he could feel changes beginning that went deeper than mere ownership or responsibility. He was connected to this woman and her unborn child by something that transcended understanding. "My ranch isn't much," he said as they stepped into the fading daylight, "but it's safe, and there's room for you there." White Dawn placed a hand on her belly, and Samuel could swear he saw the child move in response to her touch. "Safety is not something that can be purchased with silver coins, Samuel Whitmore, but perhaps it can be earned through choices made with an open heart." The wagon ride back to the ranch was conducted in silence, but it was the comfortable quiet of two people who understood that words were inadequate for what was passing between them. Samuel found himself stealing glances at his passenger, noting the way she held herself with dignity despite her circumstances, the way her eyes constantly scanned the horizon as if watching for something that might be approaching. The ranch house looked smaller than usual when they arrived, its weathered boards and sagging porch suddenly seeming inadequate for what was about to unfold. Samuel helped White Dawn down from the wagon, noting how her hand trembled slightly as she took his arm. Whether from exhaustion, fear, or something else entirely, he couldn't tell. "The baby is coming soon," she said as they reached the porch. "Tonight, I think." Samuel felt his heart skip a beat. He'd helped deliver calves and foals, but a human birth was something entirely different. "Should I ride for the doctor in town?" White Dawn shook her head. "No doctor would come for a Lakota woman, and this birth is not meant for white medicine. This child will come into the world as their ancestors did, under the open sky and with the blessing of the spirits." As if summoned by her words, the wind began to pick up, carrying with it the scent of sage and something else, something that reminded Samuel of old battlefields and unburied bones. The sky, which had been clear moments before, began to fill with clouds that moved against the natural direction of the wind. "There's something you should know," White Dawn said as they entered the house. "The child I carry is not just my child. Their father was a warrior named Thunderhorse, killed defending our village from cavalry raiders 2 years ago. Before he died, he spoke to the spirits, asking them to watch over his unborn child. The spirits agreed, but their protection comes with a price." Samuel lit the oil lamps with shaking hands, their warm glow doing little to chase away the chill that seemed to be settling over the ranch. "What kind of price?" "When the child cries for the first time, it will be a signal. A call to all those who died defending our people, telling them that their watch is not over. They will come, Samuel. All of them. 1,000 warriors who fell in battle, ready to protect this child and punish those who would harm it." The wind was growing stronger now, rattling the windows and causing the oil lamps to flicker. Samuel could hear something in its howl that sounded almost like voices, speaking in languages he didn't recognize, but somehow understood. They were calling out names, places, battles that had been fought and lost in the long war between the white settlers and the native peoples. White Dawn gripped his arm suddenly, her face contorting with pain. "It's time," she whispered. "The child is coming, and with it, everything will change." Samuel helped her to the bedroom, his movements automatic despite the fear that was building in his chest. Outside, the wind continued to grow in intensity, and he could swear he heard the sound of horses approaching, hundreds of them, their hooves thundering across the dried earth of his ranch. But when he looked out the window, he saw only darkness, and the swirling patterns of dust and debris caught in the unnatural wind. Whatever was coming, it wasn't something that could be seen with ordinary eyes. White Dawn's labor began in earnest as the clock struck midnight, and with each contraction, the supernatural wind grew stronger. Samuel found himself caught between the immediate need to help with the birth and the growing certainty that forces beyond his understanding were gathering just beyond the walls of his simple ranch house. The child was coming, and with it, the fulfillment of a promise made by spirits who had waited 2 years for this moment. Samuel had paid $1 silver for a pregnant woman, but he was beginning to understand that the real cost of this transaction was something far greater than money. As White Dawn's cries of labor mixed with the howling wind, Samuel pressed his back against the bedroom door and prepared to face whatever consequences his desperate choice had unleashed upon the world. The first scream pierced the night like a blade through silk, and Samuel felt the very air around him thicken with an energy that made his teeth ache. White Dawn's labor had been progressing for 3 hours, and with each passing moment, the supernatural phenomena surrounding the ranch house intensified. The oil lamps flickered in patterns that seemed almost like Morse code. Shadows danced without anything to cast them, and the temperature in the bedroom dropped so suddenly that Samuel's breath began to fog. "Something's wrong," he muttered, pressing a damp cloth to White Dawn's forehead. But even as he spoke, he knew that wrong wasn't the right word. This wasn't malfunction or accident. This was power, ancient and purposeful, responding to the imminent arrival of a child whose destiny had been written in blood and spirit long before conception. White Dawn's eyes snapped open, and Samuel saw that they had changed. Where before they had been deep brown, now they seemed to contain flecks of silver that moved like mercury. When she spoke, Her voice carried harmonics that shouldn't have been possible from a human throat. "The ancestors are gathering," she whispered. Her words somehow audible, despite the howling wind that threatened to tear the roof from the house. "Can you feel them, Samuel? Can you feel the weight of their presence?" Samuel could. It was like standing at the edge of a vast canyon, sensing the immense depth without being able to see the bottom. The air itself seemed crowded with invisible presences, and he found himself looking over his shoulder at empty corners that somehow didn't feel empty at all. Outside, the wind had taken on a rhythmic quality, like the beating of enormous drums. But beneath that sound, Samuel began to hear something else, the distant thunder of hoofbeats, growing closer with each passing moment. Not the hoofbeats of ordinary horses, but something deeper, more resonant, as if the very earth was responding to their approach. "They're coming," White Dawn said, her voice now carrying a note of wonder mixed with fear. "The warriors' thunder. Horse called upon. They've been waiting in the place between worlds, and now they're riding to answer the summons." Samuel moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. The moon, which had been nearly full when they'd arrived at the ranch, now seemed to pulse with an inner light that cast everything in sharp relief. The familiar landscape of his property looked alien in this illumination, the rolling hills and scattered rocks taking on the appearance of ancient burial grounds. And then he saw them. At first, they were just shadows moving against the horizon, dark shapes that might have been clouds or distant mountains. But as they drew closer, Samuel realized with a mixture of terror and awe that he was witnessing something that belonged more to legend than to the waking world. The riders came in, a formation that stretched across the entire width of the valley, their numbers beyond counting. Each warrior sat astride a horse that seemed to be made of starlight and shadow, their forms shifting between solid matter and translucent energy. The riders themselves were dressed in the regalia of a dozen different tribes, their faces painted for war, their weapons glinting with an otherworldly light. But it was their leader who drew Samuel's attention and held it with magnetic force. The warrior rode a horse that was pure white, its mane and tail flowing like liquid moonlight. The rider himself was tall and broad-shouldered, his chest bare except for a breastplate made of what looked like polished bone. His face was painted with symbols that seemed to move and change as Samuel watched, and his eyes blazed with a fire that had nothing to do with the living world. "Thunder Horse," White Dawn breathed, her voice filled with love and longing. "He has kept his promise." The spectral army drew closer, and Samuel could now make out individual details that made his rational mind rebel against what his eyes were seeing. Some of the warriors bore wounds that told the story of their deaths, arrow shafts protruding from chests, scalp wounds that gleamed whitely in the moonlight, the terrible marks of cavalry sabers. These were the restless dead, the spirits of those who had died defending their people and their way of life. As the ghostly host approached the ranch house, Samuel felt a change in the air pressure that made his ears pop. The very fabric of reality seemed to be stretching, making room for forces that didn't belong in the world of the living. The wooden walls of the house began to creak and groan, not from the wind, but from the sheer weight of supernatural presence pressing against them. White Dawn's contractions were coming faster now, and with each one, the spectral army drew closer. Samuel realized with growing certainty that the birth and the arrival of the ghost warriors were connected, two parts of the same cosmic event that had been set in motion when he'd placed that silver coin in Morrison's palm. "The child, White." Dawn gasped, her face contorted with pain and effort. "The child is the key. Their spirit will bridge the gap between the world of the living and the realm of the ancestors. When they cry for the first time, it will be heard in both worlds." Samuel knelt beside the bed, his hands shaking as he prepared to assist with the birth. He had no medical training, no experience with human delivery, but something deeper than knowledge was guiding his actions. It was as if the spirits themselves were directing him, showing him what needed to be done. The ghostly warriors had reached the perimeter of the ranch now, and Samuel could see them more clearly through the window. They sat motionless on their phantom horses, arranged in perfect formation, their weapons ready but not threatening. They were waiting, Samuel realized. Waiting for the moment when the child would announce their arrival to the world. "I can see the head," Samuel said, his voice barely audible over the supernatural wind. "The baby's coming." White Dawn's scream of effort seemed to tear a hole in the fabric of night itself. The oil lamps flared so brightly that Samuel had to shield his eyes, and for a moment, the bedroom filled with light that had no earthly source. In that radiance, Samuel caught a glimpse of figures standing in the corners of the room, tall, noble shapes that he somehow knew were the spirits of White Dawn's ancestors, come to witness the birth of their descendant. The child slipped into the world with a suddenness that took Samuel's breath away. One moment he was supporting White Dawn through her labor. The next he was holding a tiny, perfect human being whose skin seemed to glow with an inner light. The baby's eyes were open, and Samuel found himself staring into depths that held the wisdom of ages. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. The wind stopped howling, the spectral warriors sat motionless, and even the oil lamps burned with steady, unwavering flame. Everything waited for the sound that would change everything. Then the child drew in their first breath and released it, in a cry that shattered the silence like breaking glass. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. The baby's cries seemed to echo from every direction at once, amplified by forces that existed beyond the physical world. Samuel felt the sound penetrate his bones, his very soul, carrying with it a message that transcended language or culture. It was a declaration of arrival, a statement of purpose, and a call to arms all rolled into one. Outside, the army of ghost warriors responded with a war cry that would have awakened the dead if they hadn't already been standing among them. The sound rolled across the valley like thunder, shaking the foundations of the ranch house and sending wildlife fleeing in all directions. Samuel pressed his hands to his ears, but the sound seemed to come from inside his head as much as from the world around him. The spectral army began to move, but not toward the house. Instead, they spread out across the ranch property, taking up positions that Samuel somehow understood were defensive. They were creating a perimeter, a barrier between the newborn child and anything that might threaten them. Thunder Horse himself dismounted from his phantom steed and approached the house. As he drew near, Samuel could see that the warrior's face was noble and fierce, marked by the kind of quiet strength that comes from absolute certainty of purpose. When he reached the porch, he stopped and looked directly at Samuel through the window. Their eyes met across the boundary between life and death, and in that moment, Samuel understood everything. The child he held was not just any baby. They were the inheritor of a legacy that stretched back through generations of warriors, medicine men, and leaders. The spirits had chosen this child to be their representative in the world of the living, their voice in an age when the old ways were disappearing. Thunder Horse raised his hand in what might have been a greeting or a blessing, and Samuel felt compelled to respond in kind. The gesture created a connection between them, an understanding that transcended the barriers of race, culture, and mortality. They were both guardians now, protectors of something precious and irreplaceable. White Dawn had been watching the interaction with eyes that held both pride and sorrow. "He wants to see his child," she whispered. "But he cannot enter the house. The boundary between worlds is too strong here." Samuel looked down at the baby in his arms, then back at the spectral figure on his porch. Without fully understanding why, he walked to the window and held the child up so that Thunder Horse could see them clearly. The warrior's face transformed with an expression of such pure joy that Samuel felt tears streaming down his own cheeks. Thunder Horse spoke then, his voice carrying despite the glass between them. The words were in Lakota, but Samuel understood. them as clearly as if they had been spoken in English. "My child," the ghost warrior said, "you carry the hopes of all who came before you. These spirits will guard you always, and through you, the memory of our people will never die." The baby seemed to respond to their father's voice, their tiny hand reaching toward the window. For a moment, Samuel could have sworn he saw thunder. Horse's spectral form solidify, becoming almost solid enough to touch. But then the moment passed, and the warrior stepped back, his form once again translucent and otherworldly. As Samuel watched, Thunder Horse remounted his phantom horse and rode back toward the center of the ghostly army. But he didn't leave. Instead, he took up a position where he could watch over the house, his spectral warriors arranged around him in a formation that spoke of eternal vigilance. The immediate drama of the birth was over, but Samuel realized that his involvement in this supernatural event was far from finished. The child in his arms was now his responsibility, and with that responsibility came obligations that extended far beyond the normal duties of guardianship. "What happens now?" he asked White Dawn, who was resting against the pillows with an expression of exhaustion and relief. "Now we raise this child," she replied simply, "but not as ordinary people would. This child will need to learn the ways of both worlds, the world of the living and the world of the spirits. They will need teachers who understand both traditions." Samuel felt the weight of the baby in his arms, so small and vulnerable, yet somehow he could sense the power that lay dormant within them. "And the warriors outside? They will remain as long as they are needed," White Dawn said. "As long as there are those who would harm this child or what they represent, the spirits will stand guard. You paid $1 silver for a pregnant woman, Samuel Whitmore, but what you really purchased was a place in a story that began long before you were born and will continue long after you're gone." The wind had died down to a gentle breeze, and the supernatural light that had filled the bedroom was fading to something more natural. But Samuel knew that nothing would ever be truly natural again. The presence of the ghost warriors had changed the very nature of his property, transforming it from a simple cattle ranch into something that existed at the intersection of two worlds. As dawn began to break over the eastern hills, Samuel could see the spectral army more clearly. They were still there, still maintaining their vigilant watch, but their forms were becoming more translucent as the sun rose. They were creatures of night and shadow, and the coming of day would force them to retreat to whatever realm they inhabited between their moments of manifestation. But they would return. Samuel knew. Every night, they would resume their guard duty, protecting the child and by extension, protecting him and White Dawn as well. The ranch that had been on the verge of foreclosure was now under the protection of forces that no earthly power could challenge. "We should give the child a name," White Dawn said softly, "something that honors both worlds they will inhabit." Samuel considered this, looking down at the baby's peaceful face. "What would you suggest?" "Among my people, names are chosen based on signs and portents," she replied. "This child was born under the protection of 1,000 warrior spirits in a place where two worlds meet, perhaps. Spirit Walker? One who moves between the realm of the living and the realm of the ancestors." Samuel nodded, feeling the rightness of the name. Spirit Walker it is. As if responding to their newly given name, the baby opened their eyes and looked directly at Samuel. In that gaze, he saw intelligence far beyond what should have been possible in a newborn. And something else, a recognition that made his heart race with excitement and fear. This child knew who he was, understood the role he had chosen to play in their story. Samuel was no longer just a failing rancher trying to save his land. He was a guardian, a protector, a bridge between the world of the living and the supernatural forces that had chosen to make their presence known. The foreclosure notice from the bank seemed laughable now. What banker would dare to seize property that was under the protection of 1,000 ghost warriors? What authority in the territorial government would challenge forces that predated the establishment of any white settlement in the valley? As the sun climbed higher, the spectral army began to fade, but Samuel could still sense their presence. They hadn't left, they had simply stepped back into the shadows, waiting for darkness to return so they could resume their visible patrol. The ranch was no longer his alone. It belonged to something larger, something that connected the present to the past and the future in ways that defied conventional understanding. White Dawn had fallen asleep, exhausted by the ordeal of birth and the supernatural events that had accompanied it. Samuel continued to hold Spirit Walker, marveling at the child's calm demeanor and the way they seemed to watch everything with eyes that held ancient wisdom. The morning brought with it a sense of profound change. The drought that had plagued the valley for months was breaking, and Samuel could see clouds gathering on the horizon that promised rain. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. The birth of Spirit Walker had somehow restored the natural balance that had been disrupted. As he sat in the growing daylight, holding a child who was destined to bridge two worlds, Samuel realized that his desperate act of paying $1 silver for a pregnant woman had transformed into something far more significant. He had become part of a story that would be told for generations, a tale of spirits and warriors, of love transcending death, and of the price that must sometimes be paid to preserve what is sacred. The lonely rancher who had counted his last few dollars the night before was gone. In his place sat a man who had found his true purpose, holding a child whose destiny would reshape the very nature of the world around them. 3 weeks after Spirit Walker's birth, the changes to the Whitmore ranch had become impossible to ignore. The drought that had devastated the valley for months had ended with a rainfall that seemed to know exactly where it was needed most. Samuel's creek ran full and clear. His pastures had turned green overnight, and cattle that had wandered off months ago began returning as if drawn by some invisible force. But the most dramatic change was in the town's reaction to Samuel himself. Word had spread quickly through Eagle Creek Valley that something extraordinary had happened at the isolated ranch, though the details varied wildly depending on who was telling the story. Some claimed Samuel had struck a deal with Indian spirits. Others whispered about mysterious lights and phantom riders seen in the distance. The banker Ezra Hawthorne had made 3 separate trips to the ranch, each time turning back before reaching the property line, his face pale and his hands shaking. Samuel stood on his porch in the early morning light, Spirit Walker sleeping peacefully in his arms while White Dawn tended to the small garden that had somehow flourished despite the previous drought. The baby had grown remarkably in just 3 weeks, their eyes now tracking movement with an intelligence that unsettled visitors and filled Samuel with a mixture of pride and apprehension. The ghost warriors were invisible during daylight hours, but their presence was constant. Samuel had learned to recognize the signs, the way horses would refuse to approach certain areas of the property, the spots where the grass grew in perfect circles, the sensation of being watched by benevolent but alien eyes. At night, when the spectral army became visible, Samuel would sometimes sit on his porch and watch them patrol the perimeter, their forms shifting between solid matter and translucent energy. "Someone's coming," White Dawn said, straightening from her work and shading her eyes against the morning sun. Samuel followed her gaze and saw a dust cloud approaching from the direction of town. As it drew closer, he could make out a single rider pushing his horse hard across the prairie. Rider was Benjamin Torres, the youngest deputy in the county and one of the few lawmen who had ever treated Samuel with basic respect. Benjamin's horse was lathered with sweat, and his face was tight with urgency as he pulled up at the ranch house. "Samuel," Benjamin called out, barely waiting for his mount to stop. "You need to know what's happening in town. There's been developments." Samuel handed Spirit Walker to White Dawn and stepped down from the porch. "What kind of developments?" Benjamin dismounted, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon as if expecting trouble to materialize at any moment. Captain Morrison's been talking. He's been in the saloon every night for the past week, drinking and telling stories about what happened here. Claims he sold you something that wasn't his to sell. The news hit Samuel like a physical blow. Morrison had been the catalyst for everything that had transpired. The man who had brought White Dawn to the trading post and initiated the transaction that had changed all their lives. If he was having second thoughts, or worse, if he was planning to reclaim what he'd sold, the consequences could be catastrophic. What exactly is he saying? Samuel asked, though he dreaded the answer. He's claiming that White Dawn is actually his property, Benjamin replied, his voice dropping to a whisper. Says she was captured during a raid on a Lakota settlement and that he has legal ownership papers. He's filed a complaint with the territorial authorities, demanding that she be returned to him. White Dawn had been listening to the conversation, and Samuel saw her face go pale. "He cannot take me back," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "I would die before I returned to that man." Samuel felt a cold rage building in his chest. He had suspected that Morrison's motives were less than honorable, but the idea that the man had been trafficking in human beings made his stomach turn. "What kind of legal papers?" "That's the problem," Benjamin said, running a hand through his hair. "They look legitimate. Morrison claims he purchased White Dawn from a cavalry unit that captured her during a skirmish near the Canadian border. He's got documentation that appears to be signed by military officials." "Forged," White Dawn said immediately. "I was never captured. My village was attacked, yes, but I escaped into the mountains. Morrison found me there when I was already pregnant, alone, and starving. He offered me food and shelter in exchange for ... services." The implications of her words made Samuel's blood boil. Morrison hadn't just been trafficking in human beings. He'd been exploiting a vulnerable woman who had lost everything. The fact that he now wanted to reclaim her as property was beyond despicable. "There's more," Benjamin continued reluctantly. "Morrison isn't working alone. He's got backing from some powerful people in the territorial capital. Men who see profit in the Indian troubles and who don't much care about the methods used to achieve it." Samuel looked at Spirit Walker, who was awake and watching the adults with those unnaturally intelligent eyes. The child seemed to sense the tension in the air, their small hands reaching toward Samuel as if seeking comfort. The thought of Morrison or anyone else taking this family away from him was unthinkable. "When are they coming?" Samuel asked. "Tomorrow morning," Benjamin replied. "Morrison's riding with a territorial marshal and a half-dozen men. They've got legal authority to search the property and remove White Dawn if they find her here." Samuel felt the world tilting around him. All the supernatural protection in the world wouldn't matter if the territorial government decided to intervene. The ghost warriors could frighten off bandits and wild animals, but they couldn't stop legal proceedings or prevent the seizure of property under territorial law. "There might be a way," White Dawn said quietly, "but it would require great courage and a willingness to trust in forces that your people don't understand." Both men turned to look at her, and Samuel saw something in her expression that made his heart race. She was planning something, and from the look in her eyes, it was going to be dangerous. "What are you thinking?" Samuel asked. "Tonight, when the moon is full, I can perform a ceremony that will bind Spirit Walker to this land. Permanently," she said. "It's an old ritual, one that creates a connection between a person and a place that can never be broken. But it requires a sacrifice." "What kind of sacrifice?" Benjamin asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "Blood," White Dawn replied simply, "and a willingness to accept that once the ritual is complete, neither Spirit Walker nor I will ever be able to leave this ranch. We will be tied to it for the rest of our lives." Samuel stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. "You're talking about magical binding? That's not possible." The silver coin you used to purchase my freedom wasn't ordinary silver, White Dawn reminded him. It was forged by Lakota medicine men as part of a ceremony designed to create permanent bonds between the spirit world and the physical realm. You've already participated in one supernatural ritual, Samuel. Why do you find it so hard to believe that another is possible? Samuel had no answer for that. Everything that had happened over the past few weeks had challenged his understanding of what was possible. The ghost warriors, the supernatural birth, the restoration of his land, all of it defied rational explanation. If White Dawn said she could perform a ritual that would protect her and Spirit Walker from Morrison's legal claims, who was he to doubt her? What would I need to do? He asked. The ceremony requires 3 participants, White Dawn explained. Myself, Spirit Walker, and the person who will serve as our protector. You would need to join us in the ritual, Samuel. You would need to bind yourself to this land just as we will be bound to it. The implications of her words were staggering. Samuel was being asked to tie himself permanently to the ranch, to accept that he would never be able to leave this place for the rest of his life. It was a form of voluntary imprisonment, albeit one that would protect the people he had come to care about. I'll do it, he said without hesitation. Benjamin looked at him as if he'd lost his mind. Samuel, you're talking about participating in some kind of pagan ritual. The territorial authorities will never recognize it as legally binding. They won't have to, White Dawn said. The binding won't be legal, it will be spiritual. The land itself will recognize our connection to it, and it will protect us from those who would harm us. Samuel felt a strange certainty settling over him. This was the right choice, the only choice that made sense given everything that had happened. He had paid $1 silver for a pregnant woman, but what he had really purchased was a place in a story that was larger than any of them had imagined. When do we begin? He asked. At midnight, White Dawn replied, when the veil between worlds is thinnest and the spirits are most active. But Samuel, you must understand, once this ritual is complete, there will be no going back. You will be tied to this land until the day you die. Samuel looked around at the ranch that had been his family's legacy for 3 generations. The thought of never leaving it should have felt like a prison sentence, but instead, it felt like coming home. This land had shaped him, sustained him, and now it was going to protect him and the people he loved. I understand, he said. Benjamin shook his head in disbelief. You're all completely insane. But if you're determined to go through with this, you should know that I'll do what I can to delay Morrison and his men. I can't stop them, but I might be able to buy you some time. Thank you, Samuel said, gripping the deputy's hand. That means more than you know. After Benjamin left, Samuel spent the day preparing for the ceremony. White Dawn had given him a list of items that would be needed: sage, sweetgrass, a knife that had never drawn blood, and several other materials that he had to search for around the ranch. The ghost warriors seemed to sense that something important was about to happen, and even during the daylight hours, Samuel could feel their presence more strongly than usual. As evening approached, White Dawn began to prepare Spirit Walker for the ritual. She dressed the baby in a tiny outfit made from white buckskin, decorated with beadwork that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light. The child remained calm throughout the preparations, their dark eyes tracking every movement with that unsettling intelligence. Are you afraid? Samuel asked as they waited for midnight to arrive. Yes, White Dawn admitted, but not of the ceremony itself. I'm afraid of what will happen if we don't perform it. Morrison is a cruel man, Samuel. If he takes me back, he will use me until I break, and then he will sell Spirit Walker to the highest bidder. This child's destiny is too important to allow that to happen. Samuel nodded, understanding completely. The ritual might be dangerous, but the alternative was unthinkable. As midnight approached, they made their way to the center of the ranch, where White Dawn had prepared a circle of stones. The ghost warriors were visible now, arranged in a vast ring around the ritual site, their spectral forms glowing with an ethereal light. Thunderhorse sat motionless on his phantom steed at the edge of the circle, his eyes fixed on his child with an expression of fierce protectiveness. The other warriors maintained their positions, creating a barrier between the ritual site and the outside world. "Are you ready?" White Dawn asked, taking Spirit Walker in her arms. Samuel looked around at the assembled spirits, at the woman who had become so important to him, and at the child whose destiny was intertwined with his own. 3 weeks ago, he had been a desperate man on the verge of losing everything. Now he was about to participate in a supernatural ritual that would bind him to this land forever. "I'm ready," he said. The ceremony began with White Dawn singing. In Lakota, her voice carrying across the prairie with a power that seemed to make the very air vibrate. The ghost warriors joined their voices to hers, creating a harmony that spoke of ancient traditions and sacred bonds. Samuel felt the song penetrating his bones, changing something fundamental about his connection to the land beneath his feet. White Dawn handed him the knife, its blade gleaming in the moonlight. Without hesitation, he drew it across his palm, letting his blood drip onto the earth. The moment his blood touched the ground, Samuel felt a shock of connection that traveled through his entire body. The land was alive, he realized, and it was welcoming him home. White Dawn followed suit, her blood mixing with his in the sacred circle. When she held Spirit Walker's tiny hand and made the smallest of cuts, letting a few drops of the baby's blood join theirs, the earth itself seemed to pulse with recognition. The ritual reached its climax as the three of them stood together in the center of the circle, their blood mingling with the soil while the ghost warriors chanted in languages that predated written history. Samuel felt his consciousness expanding, touching something vast and ancient that had been waiting for this moment. The binding was complete. Samuel could feel it settling into his bones, his blood, his very soul. He was no longer just a man who lived on this land. He was part of it, connected to every blade of grass, every stone, every drop of water. And through that connection, he was also bound to White Dawn and Spirit Walker, their fates intertwined in ways that transcended ordinary understanding. As dawn broke over the ranch, Samuel knew that Morrison and his men would find their legal papers worthless. The land itself would protect those who belonged to it, and no earthly authority could break the bonds that had been forged in blood and spirit under the light of a full moon. The transformation was complete. Samuel Whitmore was no longer just a rancher struggling to save his property. He was a guardian of something sacred, bound to protect it with his life, and connected to forces that would ensure his success. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch as Samuel felt the full weight of the blood ritual settling into his consciousness. Every step he took across his property now resonated with a connection so profound it made his previous relationship with the land seem like that of a stranger. He could sense the moisture content in the soil, feel the pulse of life running through the root systems of every plant, and detect the movements of animals across the entire valley. The binding had transformed him into something between human and elemental guardian. White Dawn emerged from the house carrying Spirit Walker, and Samuel noticed immediately that she too had been changed by the ceremony. Her movements held a new grace, as if she were walking in perfect harmony with the earth beneath her feet. The baby's eyes seemed even more alert than before, tracking the flight of birds with an intensity that suggested they could see far more than the visible spectrum. "They're coming," White Dawn said, though Samuel couldn't see or hear anything approaching. But he trusted her enhanced senses completely now. The ritual had connected all three of them, not just to the land, but to each other in ways that transcended normal human perception. Samuel concentrated, extending his awareness across the property boundaries. There he could feel them now. 7 riders approaching from the east, their horses' hooves creating vibrations that the earth faithfully transmitted to his consciousness. Morrison was among them, his presence like a dark stain against the natural harmony of the valley. "How long do we have?" Samuel asked. "Perhaps an hour," White Dawn replied. "But Samuel, you must understand something. The ritual last night has made us more than human, but it has also made us more vulnerable in some ways. Our connection to this land is our greatest strength, but if someone were to somehow sever that connection..." She didn't need to finish the thought. Samuel understood. They had gained incredible power, but they had also created a potential weakness. If Morrison or his allies somehow found a way to break their bond with the land, the consequences could be catastrophic. The ghost warriors began to materialize even though dawn had not yet fully faded. Samuel had never seen them appear during daylight hours before, but the approaching threat was apparently significant enough to call them forth regardless of the time. Thunder Horse took his usual position at the head of the spectral army, his war paint seeming more vivid than usual in the morning light. "The spirits are preparing for battle," White Dawn observed. "They know that what's coming will be more than just a legal dispute." Samuel felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" "Morrison didn't just bring territorial marshals," she explained. "I can sense something else with them. Something that doesn't belong in the world of the living. Morrison has found someone who understands the supernatural forces at work here, and he's brought them to counter our protections." As if summoned by her words, Samuel caught sight of the approaching riders cresting the hill that marked the eastern boundary of his property. At their head rode Morrison, his cavalry uniform now complemented by items that definitely hadn't been military issue. Feathers and bones hung from his saddle, and Samuel could see what looked like painted symbols covering his horse's flanks. Beside Morrison rode a man Samuel didn't recognize, tall and gaunt, dressed in a long black coat that seemed to absorb the morning sunlight. This stranger carried a staff topped with what appeared to be a human skull, and even at a distance, Samuel could feel waves of malevolent energy radiating from his direction. "A medicine man," White Dawn said, her voice tight with concern. "But not one who serves the natural order. This one traffics with dark spirits, the kind that feed on pain and corruption." The riders stopped just outside the boundary of Samuel's property, and Morrison called out in a voice that carried clearly across the distance, "Samuel Whitmore, by the authority of the territorial government, I demand you surrender the Indian woman White Dawn and her child to my custody." Samuel stepped off his porch and walked toward the property line, feeling the earth energizing him with each step. The ghost warriors moved to flank him, their spectral forms becoming more solid and menacing as they drew closer to the living intruders. "White Dawn is under my protection," Samuel called back. "She and her child are staying here of their own free will." Morrison's laugh was harsh and mocking. "Your protection? From what I hear, you've been dabbling in savage magic, Whitmore. That might impress the local farmers, but it won't stop federal law." The dark medicine man beside Morrison raised his skull-topped staff and began to chant in a language that made Samuel's skin crawl. The words seemed to writhe in the air like living things, and wherever they touched, the grass began to wither and die. The ghost warriors responded immediately, their war cries rising to counter the malevolent incantation. "You see?" Morrison shouted over the supernatural cacophony. "I've brought my own medicine, Whitmore. Meet Cornelius Blackthorne, formerly of the Union Army's Experimental Warfare Division. He knows how to deal with restless spirits." Blackthorne's chanting intensified, and Samuel watched in horror as dark shapes began to coalesce around the mounted men. These weren't the noble spirits of fallen warriors, they were something else entirely, twisted and hungry things that seemed to devour light wherever they manifested. The battle was joined immediately. Thunder Horse led a charge of ghost warriors toward the invaders, their phantom weapons clashing against the shadow creatures that Blackthorne had summoned. The sound of the conflict was unlike anything Samuel had ever heard. The ring of spectral steel mixed with inhuman howls and the thunder of hooves that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. But Samuel quickly realized that this was more than just a supernatural confrontation. While the spirits battled overhead, Morrison and his remaining men were dismounting and preparing to advance on foot. They carried not just conventional weapons, but also items that Samuel recognized as being designed to counter spiritual protection: iron chains, bottles of what looked like blessed water, and symbols that hurt to look at directly. "They're trying to reach the house," White Dawn said, appearing at Samuel's shoulder with Spirit Walker clutched protectively to her chest. "If they can get past the outer perimeter, they might be able to disrupt the ritual circle." Samuel felt the land itself responding to the threat. The ground beneath Morrison's feet began to shift and buckle, making it difficult for the men to maintain their footing. Roots erupted from the soil to tangle around their ankles, and stones seemed to leap up to strike them from impossible angles. But Blackthorn was ready for such resistance. He pulled out a vial of dark liquid and poured it onto the ground, speaking words that made the very air seem to recoil in disgust. Wherever the liquid touched, the Earth's rebellion ceased, creating a dead zone where the natural defenses couldn't function. "He's severing the connection," White Dawn said urgently. "If he can create enough dead space, he'll be able to reach the ritual circle." Samuel knew he had to act. The ghost warriors were holding their own against Blackthorn's shadow creatures, but they couldn't stop the advance of the living men. That responsibility fell to him, and the power that the blood ritual had awakened within him. He knelt and placed both hands flat against the earth, opening himself completely to the connection that bound him to the land. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Power flowed through him like electricity, the accumulated life force of every living thing on the ranch becoming his to command. The ground around Morrison's men exploded upward in a geyser of soil and stone. Trees that had been saplings moments before erupted into full maturity, their branches intertwining to create an impenetrable barrier. Vines thick as a man's arm burst from the earth to wrap around the intruder's weapons and limbs. But the effort of channeling so much power was exhausting. Samuel felt his strength draining away, and he realized that he couldn't maintain this level of supernatural defense indefinitely. Blackthorn seemed to understand this as well, because his chanting took on a new urgency as he worked to counter each manifestation of the land's power. "There has to be another way," Samuel gasped, struggling to his feet as the earth continued to buck and heave around him. Dawn's eyes widened with sudden understanding. "The silver coin," she said. "The one you used to purchase my freedom. It's still connected to the ritual magic that created it. If we could find it... Samuel's heart sank. "Morrison has it. I gave it to him as payment." "Then we take it back," White Dawn said simply. "The coin is the key to all of this. It was forged to create permanent bonds between the spirit world and the physical realm. If we can reclaim it and use it properly, we can banish Blackthorn and his dark spirits permanently." The idea was audacious and dangerous, but Samuel could see the logic in it. The silver coin had been the catalyst for everything that had happened: his meeting with White Dawn, the supernatural birth of Spirit Walker, the arrival of the ghost warriors. If they could turn that same power against their enemies, they might be able to end this conflict once and for all. "How do we get close enough?" Samuel asked. "Morrison's men are armed, and Blackthorn has those shadow creatures protecting him." "We don't go to them," White Dawn said, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "We bring them to us." Before Samuel could ask what she meant, White Dawn began to sing, not the ritual chants she had used during the blood ceremony, but something older and more primal, a mother's lullaby that seemed to resonate with the very fabric of reality. Spirit Walker responded immediately, their tiny voice joining their mother's in a harmony that shouldn't have been possible for someone so young. The sound was beautiful and terrible at the same time, carrying notes that existed beyond the normal range of human hearing. The effect on the battlefield was immediate and dramatic. The shadow creatures that Blackthorn had summoned began to writhe and dissipate, unable to maintain their coherence in the face of such pure spiritual harmony. Even the ghost warriors paused in their fighting, their spectral forms glowing brighter as they absorbed power from the song. But it was Morrison who showed the most dramatic reaction. The silver coin in his pocket began to glow with an intense light that was visible even through the fabric of his coat. The glow grew brighter with each note of the lullaby, until Morrison was forced to reach into his pocket and pull out the coin to keep it from burning him. The moment the silver coin was exposed to the open air, it began to sing with a voice of its own. The sound was like bells and crystal chimes, a perfect counterpoint to White Dawn's lullaby that created a resonance powerful enough to shatter windows for miles around. Morrison stared at the coin in horror as it began to pull itself out of his grasp, drawn by an invisible force toward the ranch house where the original ritual had taken place. He tried to close his fist around it, but the coin's surface had become too hot to touch, forcing him to drop it to the ground. The silver coin rolled across the churned earth, leaving a trail of light in its wake as it made its way toward Samuel and White Dawn. Blackthorn tried to intercept it with his staff, but the moment the skull-topped rod came into contact with the coin's radiance, it crumbled to dust. Without his focus object, Blackthorn's power began to unravel. The dead zones he had created in the earth started to heal, the natural defenses of the land reasserting themselves with renewed vigor. His remaining shadow creatures fled back to whatever dark realm had spawned them, unable to maintain their presence without his direct control. Samuel reached down and picked up the silver coin, feeling its power flowing through him like liquid fire. The connection he had forged with the land during the blood ritual was nothing compared to this. The coin was a direct conduit to the spiritual forces that governed the balance between life and death, between the world of the living and the realm of the ancestors. "Now," White Dawn said urgently, "while the barriers between worlds are thin, use the coin to bind them, Samuel. Make them part of the land's protection instead of its enemy." Samuel understood immediately. Instead of trying to drive Morrison and his men away, he was going to make them guardians of the ranch, bound by the same forces that protected White Dawn and Spirit Walker. It was a form of justice that transcended human law. They would spend the rest of their lives protecting the very thing they had come to destroy. He raised the silver coin high above his head, feeling its power building to a crescendo that would reshape the spiritual landscape of the entire valley. The ghost warriors formed a circle around him, their voices joining the supernatural harmony that was transforming enemies into allies and making the impossible into the inevitable. The final transformation was about to begin, and nothing would ever be the same again. The silver coin burned in Samuel's palm like a star torn from the heavens, its surface pulsing with patterns that seemed to rewrite themselves with each heartbeat. The power flowing through it was unlike anything he had experienced during the blood ritual. This was older, more primal, connected to forces that had shaped the world long before human civilization had taken root in the valley. Morrison and his remaining men had backed away from the supernatural display, their faces pale with terror as they witnessed the collapse of Blackthorn's dark magic. The medicine man himself lay unconscious on the ground, his body convulsing as the spiritual backlash from his destroyed focus object tore through his system. Without his guidance, the shadow creatures he had summoned were dissolving into wisps of acrid smoke. "The binding must be willing," White Dawn said, her voice carrying clearly despite the supernatural energies crackling through the air. "If you force it upon them, it will corrupt the protection and turn it into something twisted." Samuel felt the truth of her words resonating through the coin's power. The magic that had created the silver dollar was designed to forge willing partnerships between the living and the dead, not to enslave one to the other. If he tried to use it as a weapon of compulsion, he would be no better than Blackthorn with his shadow creatures. "Morrison," Samuel called out, his voice amplified by the coin's energy until it carried across the entire valley. You came here seeking to claim what you believe is yours. But what if I offered you something greater? What if I offered you a chance to become part of something eternal? The former cavalry officer's response was immediate and predictable. I don't want your devil magic, Whitmore. I want what's legally mine. Look around you, Samuel replied, gesturing to the ghost warriors, who still maintained their protective formation. Do you see legal documents floating in the air? Do you see territorial judges materializing from thin air to enforce your claims? You're not dealing with human law anymore, Morrison. You're dealing with something older and more powerful than any government. Morrison's hand moved to his sidearm, but the weapon seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds when he tried to draw it. The land itself was resisting his violent intentions, making it impossible for him to complete the motion. His men were experiencing similar difficulties, their rifles and pistols becoming too heavy to lift. The choice is simple, Samuel continued, feeling the coin's power building to a crescendo. You can continue to fight against forces you don't understand and eventually be destroyed by them. Or you can accept a different kind of existence, one where you become guardians of this land and everything it protects. Blackthorn stirred from his unconsciousness, his eyes opening to reveal pupils that had been burned white by the spiritual backlash. When he spoke, his voice was like grinding stone. You don't understand what you're offering them, Whitmore. The transformation you're describing will strip away everything that makes them human. They'll become something else entirely. And what's so sacred about remaining human? White Dawn asked, stepping forward with Spirit Walker in her arms. You traffic with demons and shadow creatures. You've already abandoned your humanity in pursuit of power. At least Samuel's offering them a chance to serve something greater than themselves. Samuel felt the coin's power reaching a critical threshold. The energy contained within it was becoming too great for the physical world to contain, and he realized that he had to make a decision soon or risk losing control entirely. The ghost warriors seemed to sense this as well, their forms becoming more solid and urgent as they prepared for whatever was about to unfold. I'll give you 1 minute to decide, Samuel announced, though he suspected the choice had already been made for all of them. The supernatural forces at work here were too powerful to be ignored or dismissed, and Morrison's legal claims seemed increasingly ridiculous in the face of such overwhelming spiritual evidence. It was one of Morrison's men who broke first. Deputy Marshal Franklin Hayes, a man in his 50s who had seen too much violence and corruption in his career, stepped forward with his hands raised in surrender. I'm tired of fighting wars that can't be won, he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. If you're offering a different path, I'll take it. The moment Hayes spoke his acceptance, the silver coin's power reached out to him like a living thing. Samuel watched in fascination as tendrils of silver light enveloped the marshal, not consuming him but transforming him from within. Hayes' weathered face grew younger, his stooped posture straightened, and his eyes took on a luminous quality that spoke of enhanced perception. I can see everything, Hayes whispered, his voice filled with wonder. Every blade of grass, every insect, every drop of water in the creek. It's all connected, all part of the same living system. The transformation was contagious. 2 more of Morrison's men stepped forward, accepting the offer of spiritual guardianship. Each was enveloped by the silver light, each emerged changed, in fundamental ways that went beyond the merely physical. They were still recognizably human, but they had become something more, protectors bound to the land by ties stronger than blood or law. Morrison himself was wavering, his practical mind warring with the evidence of his senses. This is madness, he muttered, but his words lacked conviction. The supernatural display around him was too overwhelming to dismiss as mere trickery. It was Blackthorn who forced the final decision. Despite his injuries and the destruction of his focus object, the dark medicine man still had enough power left for one final assault. He pulled a knife from his boot and lunged toward Spirit Walker, his intent clearly to harm the child whose existence had triggered this entire supernatural chain of events. But he never reached his target. Thunder Horse materialized directly. In his path, the Ghost Warrior's lance taking Blackthorn through the chest with a force that sent him flying backward. The dark medicine man's body hit the ground and immediately began to dissolve, the shadow magic that had sustained him finally consuming itself. The display of protective power was enough to convince Morrison's remaining men. They stepped forward as one, accepting the transformation that would make them guardians of the ranch rather than its destroyers. Only Morrison himself remained unchanged, his pride and stubbornness preventing him from accepting what was clearly the only viable option. "You're a fool, Morrison," Samuel said, feeling genuine pity for the man who had started this entire chain of events. "You could have been part of something magnificent. Instead, you'll remain trapped in a world of legal documents and territorial disputes while the rest of us move beyond such limitations." Morrison's response was to pull out a small derringer that he had hidden in his boot. The weapon was made of iron blessed by a corrupt priest, designed specifically to harm supernatural beings. He aimed it directly at Spirit Walker, his finger tightening on the trigger, but the shot never came. White Dawn's lullaby rose to a crescendo that shattered the derringer's barrel like glass. The blessed iron couldn't withstand the pure spiritual force of a mother's protective song, and the weapon crumbled to dust in Morrison's hands, faced with the complete failure of his plans and the transformation of his men into spiritual guardians. Morrison finally broke. He fell to his knees, his proud military bearing crumbling into despair. "I don't understand any of this," he whispered. "I just wanted to reclaim what was mine." "Nothing was ever yours," White Dawn replied, her voice gentle but firm. "You cannot own a human being, Morrison. You cannot purchase love or loyalty or spiritual power. These are gifts that must be freely given." Samuel felt the coin's power beginning to stabilize as the immediate crisis passed. The transformed men were already beginning to spread out across the ranch, their enhanced senses allowing them to detect threats and opportunities that normal humans would miss. They were becoming part of the land's natural defense system, protectors who would serve faithfully for the rest of their extended lives. "What happened to me?" Morrison asked, his voice barely audible. "That depends on you," Samuel replied. "You can accept the transformation and become a guardian like your men, or you can leave this place and never return. But if you choose to leave, you'll carry with you the knowledge that you were offered something extraordinary and chose to reject it." Morrison looked around at his transformed men, noting the peace and purpose that had replaced their earlier tension and uncertainty. They were no longer soldiers following orders or lawmen enforcing regulations. They were guardians protecting something sacred, and their faces showed the deep satisfaction that came from serving a cause greater than themselves. "I'll go," Morrison said finally, struggling to his feet. "But I'll be back. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday I'll return with enough force to break whatever spell you've cast over this place." Samuel felt a wave of sadness wash over him. Morrison was choosing to remain trapped in a world of conflict and competition, unable to see the beauty and peace that was being offered to him. "The door will always be open," he said. "When you're ready to lay down your weapons and accept a different kind of existence, you'll be welcome here." Morrison walked away without another word, his solitary figure disappearing into the morning haze. Samuel watched him go, wondering if the man would ever find the peace he was rejecting, or if he would spend the rest of his life fighting battles that could never be won. The aftermath of the confrontation brought a profound sense of change to the ranch. The newly transformed guardians were already beginning to establish patrol routes and communication systems that would ensure the property's protection for generations to come. They retained their human personalities and memories, but they had gained enhanced abilities and a connection to the land that would guide their actions. Deputy Marshal Hayes approached Samuel with a report that would have been impossible for an ordinary human to compile. "I've surveyed the entire valley," he said, his voice carrying new harmonics that suggested his vocal cords had been fundamentally altered. "There are no immediate threats, but I can sense disturbances to the east. That bear watching. Someone's been asking questions about what happened here." Samuel nodded, understanding that their victory over Morrison was just the beginning. Word of the supernatural events at the ranch would spread, attracting both the curious and the hostile. They would need to be ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. "What about the territorial government?" Samuel asked. "Morrison filed official complaints before he came here. There will be investigations, possibly military intervention." "I don't think so," White Dawn said, joining their conversation with Spirit Walker sleeping peacefully in her arms. "The silver coin's power extends beyond this ranch. It's connected to the spiritual forces that govern the entire region. Anyone who approaches with hostile intent will find themselves facing the same choice Morrison's men did: transform or leave." Samuel felt the truth of her words through his connection to the land. The ranch had become a kind of spiritual sanctuary, a place where the normal rules of territorial law and federal authority simply didn't apply. They weren't above the law, they had moved beyond it into a realm where different principles governed behavior and justice. The sun was setting as Samuel stood on his porch, watching the ghost warriors take up their nightly positions around the property. The transformed guardians moved among them like living shadows, their enhanced senses allowing them to coordinate with the spectral protectors in ways that would have been impossible for ordinary humans. "Are you happy with what we've accomplished?" White Dawn asked, settling into the chair beside him with Spirit Walker on her lap. Samuel considered the question carefully. 3 days ago, he had been a desperate man facing foreclosure and ruin. Now he was the guardian of a supernatural sanctuary, bound to the land by blood and spirit, surrounded by protectors both living and dead. The transformation had been so complete that he could barely remember what it felt like to be merely human. "I'm not sure happiness is the right word," he said finally. "I feel complete, like I found my true purpose after years of searching for something I couldn't name." White Dawn nodded, understanding completely. "The silver coin chose you, Samuel. From the moment you first saw it in Millbrook's trading post, it was calling to you. Everything that's happened since then has been part of a pattern that was set in motion long before any of us were born." Spirit Walker stirred in their mother's arms, their eyes opening to reveal the same luminous quality that marked the transformed guardians. The child was growing rapidly, their development accelerated by the supernatural forces that had shaped their conception and birth. Samuel had the distinct feeling that Spirit Walker would be walking and talking within weeks rather than months. "What comes next?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Now we build," White Dawn replied. "We create something that will last for generations, a place where the living and the dead can work together to protect what's sacred. The ranch is just the beginning, Samuel. The power contained in that silver coin is meant to spread, to create a network of protected places across the entire territory." Samuel felt the weight of destiny settling around him like a comfortable cloak. The lonely rancher who had paid $1 silver for a pregnant woman was gone, replaced by something far more significant. He was a guardian now, a protector of the balance between worlds, and the story he had begun that night in Millbrook's trading post would continue for generations to come. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Samuel heard the sound of distant drums echoing across the valley. It was a sound of celebration and victory, the ghost warriors' way of marking the successful completion of their mission. But it was also a promise, a commitment to continue their vigil for as long as they were needed. The transformation was complete, But the story was just beginning. 6 months had passed since Morrison's defeat, and the Whitmore Ranch had transformed into something that defied every conventional understanding of what a cattle operation should be. The property now stretched far beyond its original boundaries, not through legal acquisition, but through spiritual expansion. The land itself had grown, reality bending to accommodate the supernatural sanctuary that Samuel and his guardians had created. Spirit Walker was now walking and speaking in complete sentences, their development accelerated by forces that transcended normal human growth patterns. The child moved through the ranch with an authority that seemed impossible for someone so young, commanding respect from both the living guardians and the ghost warriors who continued their eternal patrol. Samuel stood in what had once been his simple barn, now transformed into a meeting hall where the various protectors of the ranch gathered each evening to coordinate their activities. The structure had somehow doubled in size without any visible construction, its walls now carved with symbols that glowed softly in the darkness and told the stories of every soul who had found sanctuary within the ranch's boundaries. "The network is expanding faster than we anticipated," reported Franklin Hayes, the former deputy marshal who had become Samuel's chief lieutenant among the living guardians. Hayes had changed dramatically since his transformation, his weathered features now bearing an ageless quality that spoke of deep connection to elemental forces. 3 more ranches in the territory have experienced supernatural awakenings in the past month. Samuel nodded, studying the map that Hayes had spread across the central table. Each location was marked with symbols that indicated the type of spiritual activity detected. Some showed the presence of beneficial spirits. Others warned of darker forces that required careful monitoring. The pattern was clear. The power that had transformed the Whitmore Ranch was spreading across the entire region, creating a web of protected territories that existed beyond the reach of conventional authority. "The territorial governor has noticed," added Maria Santos, a former bounty hunter who had arrived at the ranch 3 weeks earlier after experiencing prophetic dreams about Spirit Walker. Her transformation had been particularly dramatic, her enhanced senses now allowing her to track spiritual disturbances across hundreds of miles. "There are federal investigators asking questions in every town from here to the Colorado border." White Dawn entered the barn carrying Spirit Walker, both of them radiating the serene confidence that had become their trademark. The child's eyes immediately found the map on the table, and they pointed to a location near the Canadian border with startling precision. "Trouble coming from there," Spirit Walker announced, their voice carrying harmonics that shouldn't have been possible from such young vocal cords. "Bad men with bad medicine. They want to break what we've built." Samuel felt a chill run down his spine. Spirit Walker's pronouncements had proven remarkably accurate over the past months, their connection to the spiritual realm providing early warning of threats that normal surveillance would have missed entirely. If the child sensed danger approaching from the north, it was something that required immediate attention. "How much time do we have?" Samuel asked, though he wasn't entirely sure why he was asking a 6-month-old baby for tactical advice. 7 sons, Spirit Walker replied without hesitation. "They bring the silver poison and the spirit cages. Want to capture grandfather's warriors and make them slaves." The implications were staggering. Someone had not only figured out how to counter the ghost warriors' protection, but they had developed weapons specifically designed to enslave supernatural entities. The thought of Thunder Horse and his eternal soldiers being reduced to captive servants was enough to make Samuel's blood boil with rage. "We need to send scouts," he decided. "Find out who's behind this and what exactly they're planning." "Already done," announced a new voice from the barn's entrance. Samuel turned to see Deputy Benjamin Torres approaching, but his old friend had changed dramatically since accepting the transformation 2 months earlier. Benjamin's eyes now held flecks of silver that moved like liquid metal, and his movements carried a predatory grace that spoke of enhanced reflexes and supernatural awareness. I've been tracking a group of federal agents and military contractors. For the past week, Benjamin continued, pulling out a leather portfolio filled with detailed observations. They're calling themselves the Territorial Supernatural Regulation Division, and they have backing from some very powerful people in Washington. Samuel felt his heart sink. The one thing he had hoped to avoid was drawing the attention of the federal government, but it seemed that their supernatural sanctuary had become too significant to ignore. The network of protected territories that was spreading across the region represented a direct challenge to federal authority, and politicians were not known for tolerating such challenges. "What kind of resources are they bringing?" Hayes asked, his enhanced senses already beginning to probe the spiritual atmosphere for signs of approaching danger. 40 men, including a squad of what they're calling supernatural specialists, Benjamin replied grimly. They've got equipment I've never seen before, devices that supposedly can disrupt spiritual energy and contain ethereal entities. Plus, enough conventional firepower to level a small town. White Dawn stepped forward, her expression grave but determined. They don't understand what they're dealing with. The forces that protect this ranch aren't just ghosts that can be captured and caged. They're part of the fundamental spiritual ecology of this entire region. Disrupting them would be like damming every river and cutting down every tree. The consequences would be catastrophic. Try explaining that to federal bureaucrats, Maria said bitterly. They see supernatural phenomena as either resources to be exploited or threats to be eliminated. The idea that some things are sacred and should be left alone doesn't fit into their worldview. Samuel walked to the barn's large window, looking out across the ranch that had become the center of his universe. The ghost warriors were visible in the moonlight, their eternal patrol continuing regardless of the human concerns being discussed inside. Thunderhorse sat motionless on his phantom steed near the original ritual circle, his presence a constant reminder of the bonds that connected all the sanctuary's inhabitants. "We could fight them," Samuel said quietly. "The ghost warriors defeated Morrison's forces, and we have more protectors now than we did then. But that would just bring more federal attention, more resources arrayed against us. There's another option," Spirit Walker announced, their young voice cutting through the adult conversation with startling authority. "The Silver Father calls from the deep places. Says there's a way to make the bad men understand." Samuel turned back to the child, noting the way the other guardians immediately focused their attention on Spirit Walker's words. The baby had become an oracle of sorts, their connection to the spiritual realm providing guidance that had proven invaluable in navigating the complex challenges of managing a supernatural sanctuary. "What does the Silver Father want us to do?" Samuel asked, using the term that Spirit Walker had coined for the entity that inhabited the mystical coin. "Big ceremony," the child replied. "Show the spirit blind ones what they're trying to destroy. Make them see the connections, feel the pain they would cause." White Dawn's eyes widened with understanding. "A revelation ritual. It's dangerous, Samuel. Opening the spiritual realm to that many people at once could have unpredictable consequences. More dangerous than letting them attack us with their spirit cages and silver poison?" Samuel asked. "At least this way, we might be able to make them understand what they're really dealing with." The discussion continued deep into the night, with each guardian contributing their perspective on the proposed ritual. The consensus was clear. They needed to take drastic action to prevent the federal forces from disrupting the spiritual balance that had been so carefully established. But the ritual that Spirit Walker was proposing would require resources and coordination on a scale they had never attempted before. "We'll need to contact the other sanctuaries," Hayes decided. "If we're going to perform a revelation ritual powerful enough to affect 40 armed men, we'll need spiritual energy from across the entire network. And we'll need volunteers," added Maria. "People willing to serve as anchors during the ceremony, keeping the participants grounded in reality while their consciousnesses expanded to perceive the spiritual realm. Samuel felt the weight of leadership settling on his shoulders like a familiar burden. 6 months ago, he had been a simple rancher facing foreclosure. Now he was coordinating a supernatural defense network that spanned hundreds of miles and involved forces that most people couldn't even imagine. "Send the word," he commanded. "Tell every sanctuary in the network that we need their support. And start preparing the ritual site. We have 7 days to get ready for the most important ceremony any of us have ever attempted." The next week passed in a blur of intense preparation. Messages flew between the various sanctuaries, carried by spirit-enhanced couriers who could travel faster than any conventional messenger. Supplies began arriving from across the network: rare herbs, crystals that had been charged with spiritual energy, artifacts that had been blessed by medicine men from a dozen different tribes. The ghost warriors seemed to sense the approaching confrontation, their nightly patrols becoming more intense and focused. Thunder Horse spent hours in conference with Spirit Walker, the two of them communicating in ways that transcended normal language. Samuel often found them sitting together in perfect silence, the spectral warrior and the supernaturally gifted child sharing knowledge that existed beyond the realm of words. On the 6th day, the federal forces arrived in Eagle Creek Valley. Samuel watched their approach from the hill where Margaret's grave overlooked the ranch. Using enhanced senses to observe the convoy of military wagons and specialized equipment that represented the government's attempt to impose control over supernatural phenomena, the agents made camp just outside the valley, their position carefully chosen to allow for maximum tactical advantage, while remaining beyond the effective range of the ranch's spiritual defenses. Samuel could see them setting up devices that hummed with unnatural energy, machines designed to disrupt the very forces that made life possible in the sanctuary. "They're more prepared than we thought," Benjamin reported, returning from a scouting mission that had taken him close to the federal encampment. "Their equipment isn't just designed to contain spirits, it's designed to sever the connections between the living and the spiritual realm. If they activate those devices, they could cut us off from our power sources." Samuel felt a chill of fear run through him. The transformation that had made him and the other guardians into protectors of the sanctuary depended on their connection to the spiritual forces of the land. If that connection were severed, they would be reduced to ordinary humans facing overwhelming odds. "Then we perform the ritual tonight," he decided, "before they have a chance to activate their equipment." As darkness fell across the valley, the guardians took their positions around the expanded ritual circle that had been prepared over the past week. The site now covered nearly an acre, marked with symbols and artifacts that created a mandala of incredible complexity and power. At the center sat Spirit Walker, their small form somehow commanding attention. Despite being surrounded by dozens of adult participants, the ghost warriors formed an outer ring around the ceremony, their spectral forms glowing with anticipation as they prepared to channel their accumulated spiritual energy into the ritual. Thunder Horse stood directly behind his child, his phantom lance raised toward the star-filled sky. Samuel held the silver coin above his head, feeling its power building to levels that made his previous experiences seem like mere sparks. The artifact was responding to the collective will of every supernatural entity in the valley, drawing energy from sources that existed beyond the normal dimensions of space and time. "Begin," Spirit Walker commanded, their voice carrying across the entire valley with supernatural amplification. The revelation ritual commenced with a harmonic convergence that shook the very foundations of reality. Every guardian, every ghost warrior, every spirit that had found sanctuary within the ranch's boundaries added their voice to a chorus that transcended the limitations of physical existence. The sound built and built until it became something that could be felt in the bones rather than heard with the ears. At the federal encampment, 40 hardened agents and soldiers suddenly found themselves experiencing visions that challenged everything they believed about the nature of reality. They saw the spiritual connections that bound all living things together, felt the pain that would result from severing those connections, understood for the first time the true magnitude of what they had been sent to destroy. The revelation lasted only minutes, but its effects would endure for the rest of their lives. When the supernatural chorus finally faded, the federal forces found themselves fundamentally changed. Their perception expanded to include realms of existence they had never imagined. Samuel lowered the silver coin, feeling its power settling back into dormancy after the massive expenditure of energy. Around him, the Guardians were slowly recovering from the ritual's intensity, their faces showing the exhaustion that came from channeling forces beyond human comprehension. "Did it work?" Hayes asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The answer came in the form of a white flag being raised over the federal encampment, followed by a single rider approaching the ranch under a banner of truce. The revelation ritual had succeeded in ways that no conventional diplomacy could have achieved, opening minds and hearts to truths that existed beyond political considerations. The age of hiding was over. The supernatural sanctuary network would no longer need to operate in secrecy, protected now by understanding rather than concealment. Samuel watched the approaching federal representative with a mixture of relief and anticipation, knowing that the world was about to change in ways that even he couldn't fully comprehend. The lonely rancher's story had become something far greater than anyone could have imagined when he first paid $1 silver for a pregnant woman and her unborn child. The federal agent who approached under the white flag was Colonel Marcus Hartwell, a man whose distinguished military career had prepared him for conventional warfare, but left him utterly unprepared for the spiritual awakening he had just experienced. Samuel watched from the porch as Hartwell dismounted near the property line, his movements careful and respectful in a way that suggested profound internal change. "Mr. Whitmore," Hartwell called out, his voice carrying none of the authority and aggression that Samuel had expected from a federal representative. "I request permission to enter your sanctuary. We need to discuss what happened during the night." Samuel exchanged glances with White Dawn, who stood beside him with Spirit Walker in her arms. The child's eyes were fixed on Hartwell with an intensity that suggested they were seeing far more than the man's physical form. After a moment, Spirit Walker nodded almost imperceptibly. "You may approach," Samuel replied, stepping down from the porch to meet the colonel halfway across the yard. Hartwell walked forward slowly, his eyes constantly moving as he took in details that he obviously hadn't been able to perceive before the revelation ritual. Samuel could see the man's amazement as he witnessed the ghost warriors in full daylight, their spectral forms no longer invisible to his expanded consciousness. The colonel's hand instinctively moved toward his sidearm, then stopped as he seemed to remember that conventional weapons were useless in this environment. "What did you do to us?" Hartwell asked when he was close enough for normal conversation. "My men are different. We can see things that shouldn't be possible, feel connections that extend far beyond anything we've ever experienced." "We showed you the truth," Samuel replied simply. "The world you've been living in is just a small fraction of what actually exists. What you're seeing now is reality as it actually is, not the limited version that most people accept as complete." Hartwell nodded slowly, his expression suggesting that he was still struggling to process everything he had experienced. "The spirits they're not evil, are they? The reports we received suggested that we were dealing with hostile supernatural entities that posed a threat to territorial security. The only threat they pose is to those who would harm innocent people," White Dawn said, joining the conversation. "The ghost warriors you see are protectors, guardians who have chosen to remain in the world of the living to defend those who cannot defend themselves." As if summoned by her words, Thunderhorse materialized beside them, his spectral form solid. enough to cast a shadow in the morning sunlight. Hartwell's breath caught in his throat as he found himself face to face with a warrior who had died decades earlier, but whose presence was undeniably real and immediate. "You lead soldiers," Thunderhorse said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate from multiple dimensions simultaneously. "You understand duty, sacrifice, the willingness to give one's life for something greater than oneself. My warriors and I have made the same choice, but our service extends beyond death." Hartwell stared at the ghost warrior for a long moment before slowly nodding. "I can see that now. Before last night, I would have called this impossible, but—" He gestured helplessly at the supernatural scene around him. "Everything I thought I knew about the world has been turned upside down." Samuel felt a surge of sympathy for the colonel. The revelation ritual had been necessary, but he could only imagine how disorienting it must be to have one's entire worldview suddenly expanded to include realms of existence that conventional education insisted were impossible. "What happens now?" Samuel asked. "Your orders were to contain or eliminate supernatural threats in this region. How do you plan to report back to your superiors?" Hartwell's laugh was bitter. "I'm not sure they would believe what I've seen, even if I could find words to describe it. But I can't go back to pretending that this doesn't exist. My men feel the same way. We've been changed by what happened last night, and there's no going back to our previous ignorance." Spirit Walker stirred. In White Dawn's arms, their young voice cutting through the adult conversation with startling clarity. "The Silver Father says there's work for soldier spirits to do. Bad things stirring in the far places where the old protections have been forgotten." Samuel felt his heart skip a beat. Spirit Walker's pronouncements had always proven accurate, and the idea that there were threats beyond their current sanctuary network was deeply troubling. The work they had accomplished here might be just the beginning of a much larger struggle. "What kind of bad things?" Hartwell asked, apparently accepting that seeking military intelligence from a supernaturally gifted infant was now a reasonable course of action. "Shadowmakers from the old wars," Spirit Walker replied, their eyes taking on a distant quality that suggested they were seeing events across vast distances. "They wake up where the ground is soaked with angry blood. Want to finish what they started long ago." White Dawn's face went pale with understanding. "Battlefields," she whispered. "The child is talking about ancient battlefields where the spiritual balance was disrupted by massive loss of life. If those places are becoming active again—" She didn't need to finish the thought. Samuel could see the implications clearly enough. The network of sanctuaries they had created was designed to protect specific locations and the people within them. But if hostile supernatural forces were awakening across the entire continent, they would need to expand their efforts dramatically. How many locations are we talking about? Samuel asked, though he dreaded the answer. Spirit Walker closed their eyes for a moment, their consciousness apparently ranging across vast distances to survey the spiritual landscape. When they spoke again, their voice carried a weight that seemed impossible for someone so young. 7 times 7 places where the death shadows gather strength. Some sleep still, but many wake. They remember the old hatreds, the promises of revenge that were made in dying moments. Soon they will have power enough to act on those memories. The scope of the threat was staggering. 49 locations across the continent where supernatural entities were awakening with hostile intent. The sanctuary network that Samuel and his allies had created included only a dozen protected sites, nowhere near enough to counter such a widespread menace. "We'll need help," Samuel said, though he wasn't sure where such help might come from. "More guardians, more sanctuaries, more people willing to accept the transformation." "You'll have it," Hartwell said suddenly, his voice carrying the conviction of a man who had found a new purpose in life. "My unit is comprised of experienced soldiers who have now been exposed to supernatural reality. We can serve as the core of an expanded guardian force, helping to establish new sanctuaries and train new protectors. Samuel stared at the colonel in amazement. The man who had arrived with orders to destroy their sanctuary was now offering to help expand it across the entire continent. The revelation ritual had been even more successful than Samuel had dared to hope. Your superiors won't approve, White Dawn pointed out. The federal government sent you here to eliminate supernatural threats, not to join them. Then we'll have to convince them the same way you convinced us, Hartwell replied. The revelation ritual you performed last night affected more than just my immediate unit. The spiritual energy you released was powerful enough to touch minds across hundreds of miles. There are people in Washington who are suddenly asking very different questions about what's really happening in the territories. The implications were staggering. If the ritual had indeed affected government officials in the nation's capital, it might be possible to transform the entire federal approach to supernatural phenomena. Instead of trying to contain or eliminate such forces, the government might become an ally in protecting and nurturing them. Over the following days, Samuel found himself at the center of negotiations unlike anything in recorded history. Federal representatives arrived at the ranch not as conquerors, but as supplicants, seeking to understand forces they had only recently become aware of. The revelation ritual had created a cascade effect, awakening spiritual awareness in people who had never imagined such things were possible. But the most significant development came from an unexpected source. Morrison, the man who had started the entire chain of events by trying to reclaim White Dawn as his property, returned to the ranch with a group of followers who had experienced their own supernatural awakenings. Samuel watched from his porch as Morrison's small convoy approached, noting immediately that the former cavalry officer had been changed by his experiences since leaving the sanctuary. The arrogance and hostility that had marked his previous visit were gone, replaced by a humility that seemed to have been earned through significant suffering. "Samuel Whitmore," Morrison called out as he dismounted near the property line. "I come seeking redemption for the wrongs I've committed. The spirits have shown me the truth about my actions, and I wish to make amends." The transformation was remarkable. The man who had once tried to claim ownership of human beings was now asking for forgiveness and an opportunity to serve something greater than his own desires. Samuel felt a mixture of amazement and caution as he considered how to respond. "What changed your mind?" Samuel asked, stepping down from the porch to meet his former enemy. "Dreams," Morrison replied simply. "Every night since I left this place, I've been visited by the spirits of those I wronged during my military service. They've shown me the pain I caused, the lives I destroyed in pursuit of what I thought was duty. I can't continue living with that burden." Spirit Walker stirred in White Dawn's arms, their penetrating gaze fixed on Morrison with an intensity that made the man visibly uncomfortable. After a long moment, the child spoke with authority that transcended their apparent age. "The shadow stain is deep in this one, but not beyond cleansing. He can serve, but only after walking the pain path that leads to true understanding." Morrison nodded as if he had expected such a pronouncement. "I'm prepared to do whatever is necessary. The spirits have shown me that redemption is possible, but only through genuine service to those I once oppressed." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another unexpected visitor. Benjamin Torres came riding hard across the prairie, his enhanced senses apparently having detected something that required immediate attention. He dismounted near the group with urgent news written across his face. "We have a problem, Benjamin," announced without preamble. "The first of the awakening battlefields has become active, Little Bighorn. The shadow spirits there have begun manifesting in the physical world, and they're not friendly to anyone with white skin." Samuel felt his blood run cold. Little Bighorn was where General Custer and his men had made their final stand, one of the most famous and controversial battles in the history of the Indian Wars, if hostile spirits were awakening there with memories of that conflict fresh in their supernatural consciousness, the potential for violence was enormous. "How bad is it?" Samuel asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Bad enough that the nearest town has been evacuated," Benjamin replied grimly. "The shadow spirits aren't just manifesting. They're actively hunting anyone they perceive as connected to the forces that killed them, and they're getting stronger every day." Spirit Walker's response was immediate and unequivocal. "Must go. There. Must show the angry dead that the old wars are finished, that new alliances are possible. If we don't act soon, the shadow poison will spread to other battlefields." Samuel looked around at the assembled group, federal agents who had become allies, a former enemy seeking redemption, and supernatural guardians whose powers had grown beyond anything he had initially imagined. The sanctuary they had created at the ranch was just the beginning of something far larger and more important. "Then we go to Little Bighorn," Samuel decided. "All of us. It's time to find out if the bonds we've forged here are strong enough to heal the wounds of the past." The decision marked the beginning of a new phase in their mission. They were no longer just protecting a single sanctuary. They were embarking on a quest to heal the spiritual wounds that had been festering across the continent for decades. The silver coin's power would be tested on a scale that none of them had ever imagined. As preparations began for the journey to Little Bighorn, Samuel reflected on how far they had all come since that night when he had paid $1 silver for a pregnant woman. That simple transaction had set in motion events that were now reshaping the very nature of reality across the American territories. The lonely rancher's story had become something epic, a tale that would be told for generations. About the day when the living and the dead joined forces to heal a broken world. The journey to Little Bighorn took 3 days, but it felt like traveling through multiple lifetimes. The group that departed the Whitmore Ranch was unlike any expedition in recorded history. Living guardians, riding alongside ghost warriors, federal agents working in harmony with supernatural protectors, and at the center of it all, Spirit Walker, whose presence seemed to calm the very earth beneath their feet. As they approached the infamous battlefield, the spiritual disturbance became increasingly obvious. The sky took on an unnatural reddish tint, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with accumulated rage and grief. Birds refused to fly over the area, and even the horses became skittish as they sensed the supernatural tension that permeated the landscape. "The shadow spirits have been building strength for decades," White Dot explained as they made camp on a hill overlooking the battlefield. "Every year on the anniversary of the battle, the spiritual wounds reopen, and the anger grows stronger. Without intervention, this place will become a permanent gateway for hostile entities." Samuel could see the manifestations with his enhanced senses, dark shapes, moving across the battlefield in patterns that suggested they were reenacting the final moments of the conflict over and over again. The shadow spirits weren't just angry. They were trapped in an endless cycle of death and vengeance that prevented them from finding peace. Spirit Walker climbed down from their traveling cradle and walked to the edge of the camp, their small form silhouetted against the supernatural storm brewing over the battlefield. When they spoke, their voice carried across the entire area with otherworldly amplification. "Grandfather Thunder Horse," the child called out. "It's time to speak with the angry dead. They remember you from the long ago fighting." Thunder Horse materialized beside his descendant, his spectral form more solid than Samuel had ever seen it. The ghost warrior's expression was grave as he looked out over the battlefield where so many of his people had fallen. "Many of those spirits were my brothers in life," Thunder Horse said, his voice heavy with ancient sorrow. "They died believing that their sacrifice would protect our people and our way of life. They don't understand that the world has changed, that new alliances are possible." Morrison stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "What can I do to help?" My military record includes actions that contributed to conflicts like this. If there's a way to make amends. Spirit Walker turned to look at the former cavalry officer, their penetrating gaze seeming to see through to Morrison's very soul. You carry the weight of old choices, soldier man. But the angry dead will hear truth in your voice if you speak from genuine sorrow. Samuel felt the silver coin warming in his pocket, its power responding to the proximity of so much spiritual energy. The artifact that had started their entire journey was resonating with the accumulated pain and rage of the battlefield, offering a potential solution to the crisis. The coin wants to be used, Samuel announced, pulling out the mystical silver dollar. Its surface was glowing with internal light, patterns swirling across its face that seemed to tell the story of every conflict that had ever scarred the American continent. A healing ritual, White Dawn said, understanding immediately. But this time, we're not just binding protectors to the land. We're trying to heal wounds that have been festering for decades. The spiritual backlash could be enormous. Colonel Hartwell surveyed the battlefield with tactical precision, his military training now enhanced by supernatural awareness. My men are ready to serve as anchors during the ceremony. We understand the risks. As night fell over Little Bighorn, the group descended toward the battlefield itself. The shadow spirits became more agitated as the living intruders approached, their dark forms coalescing into shapes that bore a disturbing resemblance to the warriors who had fallen during the original conflict. But something remarkable happened. When Thunder Horse led his spectral warriors onto the battlefield, the shadow spirits paused in their eternal reenactment, recognizing the presence of allies who had fought beside them in life. For the first time in decades, the cycle of rage and vengeance was interrupted. Samuel walked to the center of the battlefield, guided by the silver coin's power to the exact spot where the spiritual wounds were deepest. The artifact in his hand was now blazing with light bright enough to illuminate the entire area, its power building toward a crescendo that would either heal the ancient trauma or destroy everything within miles. Begin the ritual, Spirit Walker commanded, their young voice carrying authority that transcended physical age. What followed was unlike any ceremony Samuel had ever experienced. Instead of binding new protectors to the land, they were attempting to release the accumulated pain and anger of decades. The silver coin became a conduit for healing energy that flowed through every participant, living and dead alike. Morrison stepped forward and began to speak, his voice carrying across the battlefield with supernatural amplification. I served with the 7th Cavalry, he announced to the assembled shadow spirits. I participated in actions that brought death and suffering to your people. I cannot undo those actions, but I can acknowledge the wrong that was done and pledge my life to preventing such tragedies in the future. The shadow spirits responded with howls of rage that shook the very ground, but Thunder Horse and his warriors moved to surround Morrison protectively. This man speaks truth, Thunder Horse declared. He offers genuine remorse and a commitment to serve justice. Will you accept his offering? The moment stretched into eternity as the shadow spirits considered the unprecedented offer of redemption from a former enemy. Samuel felt the silver coin's power reaching critical levels, ready to either facilitate healing or unleash destruction on an unimaginable scale. Then, slowly, the shadow spirits began to change. The darkness that had consumed them for decades started to fade, replaced by the noble bearing they had possessed in life. One by one, they stepped forward to accept Morrison's offer of atonement, their forms becoming luminous as the healing energy of the ritual transformed them from vengeful spirits into peaceful ancestors. The transformation spread across the entire battlefield like ripples on a pond. Ancient wounds that had festered for decades were finally healing, the accumulated trauma of conflict being released and replaced by understanding and forgiveness. The red tint faded from the sky, and for the first time in living memory, Little Bighorn became a place of peace rather than perpetual warfare. As dawn broke over the healed battlefield, Samuel felt the silver coin's power finally stabilizing. The artifact had accomplished something that conventional diplomacy could never have achieved. It had transformed a site of eternal conflict into a sanctuary where the living and the dead could find common ground. "It's finished, Spirit Walker," announced, their voice filled with a satisfaction that seemed far too mature for someone so young. "The angry dead are at peace, and the shadow poison will spread no further from this place." Samuel looked around at the transformed landscape, noting how the very grass seemed greener and the air cleaner now that the spiritual wounds had been healed. The battlefield that had been a source of supernatural menace was now protected by the same forces that guarded the Whitmore Ranch. "What happens now?" Colonel Hartwell asked, though Samuel suspected the man already knew the answer. "Now we do this 48 more times," Samuel replied, understanding finally the full scope of the mission that had begun with a single silver dollar transaction. Every battlefield, every site where spiritual wounds have been left to fester. We heal them all, one by one, until the entire continent is free from the poison of unresolved conflict. The task would take years, perhaps decades, but Samuel felt no doubt about their ability to succeed. The network of sanctuaries and guardians would continue to grow, powered by the same forces that had transformed a failing cattle ranch into a beacon of hope for both the living and the dead. 5 years later, Samuel stood once again on the porch of the Whitmore Ranch, watching Spirit Walker play in the yard with children from a dozen different families who had found sanctuary within the ever-expanding network of protected territories. The child who had summoned 1,000 ghost warriors with their first cry was now a confident young person whose supernatural abilities continued to grow in ways that amazed even their guardians. The ranch itself had become the administrative center for what historians would later call the Great Healing, a continent-wide effort that had transformed dozens of battlefields from sources of supernatural menace into sanctuaries of peace. The silver coin that had started it all now resided in a place of honor in the main house, its power dormant but always ready to be called upon when needed. White Dawn emerged from the house carrying a letter that had arrived via the supernatural courier network. "News from the eastern sanctuaries," she announced. "The last of the major battlefields has been healed. The shadow spirits at Antietam have accepted the offering of redemption and joined the network of protectors." Samuel felt a deep satisfaction settling into his bones. The lonely rancher who had once counted his last few silver dollars was now the coordinator of a supernatural network that spanned the entire continent. The simple act of paying $1 for a pregnant woman had grown into something that would change the course of history itself. "What's next?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. Spirit Walker looked up from their play, their eyes holding the same luminous quality that marked all the supernatural guardians. "The Silver Father says there are other lands across the great waters where the old wounds still bleed. The healing work is far from finished." Samuel smiled, understanding that their mission would continue to expand beyond anything he had ever imagined. The network of sanctuaries would eventually span the globe, creating a world where the living and the dead could work together to protect what was sacred and ensure that the mistakes of the past were never repeated. The story that had begun with desperation and a mystical silver coin had become something eternal, a testament to the power of redemption, the possibility of healing, and the truth that even the darkest wounds could be transformed into sources of light and hope. And in the distance, barely visible in the morning mist, Thunder Horse and his eternal warriors continued their watch, guardians of a peace that would endure for generations to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.